The other day at church, we were going through the story of Deborah, and then we get to the Song of Deborah, and you read that when princes in Israel take the lead. I got to wondering, what word is princess? Because in Hebrew, there are a couple of different words that could be translated as prince or ruler or leader or something like that. And sometimes, if you take a look at the word, that can change maybe the way that you read the passage. And so that's what I did. I opened up Logos here and I went to princes. And if you open this up, it says loosely hanging, unplaited hair on the head, leader, prince. And so then I was like, wait a second, what is going on? And so let's take a look here. If we come down here and we do a search for this particular word in Hebrew, and it'll open up, and it reads here in Deuteronomy, the heads of the enemy leaders in Judges 5, where we happen to be, when princes in Israel take the lead. Or if we come up here and we, instead of looking at the there we go, I had to pull a little bit farther. Instead of looking at the NIV, if we change this to the ESV, and then Deuteronomy 32, instead of saying the leaders, it now says long-haired. And then in Judges 5:2, it says that the leaders took the lead. So in this case here, this particular word means long-haired. And so why is it that the English translations translate it as princes? Well, chances are that it's an idiom. And what's an idiom? It's like raining cats and dogs. The literal words don't mean what they literally sound like. They mean something slightly different. They communicate in with the entire phrase as opposed to the individual words, raining cats and dogs. Likewise, a euphemism is a word that is a polite way to be able to say something that might be a little bit harsh. And so when princes in Israel take the lead, and so I was just thinking about this, that if this is the Song of Deborah, I wonder if she is trying to talk about herself. When princes in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. And so she's talking about herself, that she did what God had called her to do, and because she did what she was supposed to do as a leader, and the people followed her, then we get to praise God because he brought about the redemption of Israel. Whereas opposed to, hear this, you kings, listen, you rulers, even I will sing to the Lord. That the rulers and the kings, the leaders of Israel that should have been leading, are not leading like they should have. And then if we come down a little bit farther here, we will, I think it's Jael, we will read about how she ends up defeating the king that they are fighting against. Yeah, most blessed of women be Jael. And so I also wonder if Deborah isn't hinting at her and Jael as the leaders who have led, that have done what God had called them to do. Because what is it that Jael has done? Well, she, I think, is the Eve character in the story, whereas like Eve failed to guard the garden as a throne guardian in the temple of God in the Garden of Eden against the encroachment of evil by Satan, the serpent. Jael, she fulfills one of the promises that says that, and your seed shall crush the head of the serpent. And so if we get here, verse 26, her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the worker's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. Remember, what did it say that the seed was going to do? Crush the head, and the serpent would bruise the heel, type of a thing. And so what is she doing? She is fulfilling that promise that was given to Eve, and she has done what Eve should have done. And so I was just thinking about that in terms of when the long-haired lead, or when the princes in Israel lead. Which then also made me think about Paul when he is talking to the Corinthians, and he's talking to them about the head coverings. So let's go over here, and this is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and Paul is starting to be able to talk to them. He says, I want to commend you for following what I have told you to do. But there's things that Paul hasn't talked to them about. And those things, I think, Paul is trying to correct in his letter. And so he's commending them and at the same time trying to correct the errors of their ways. And so he says, now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. What I think is happening here is that the Corinthians are imposing their own tradition inside of the church. And Paul is saying, I commend you for keeping the things that I've told you to do, but you're also bringing your own traditions into the church, and I need to correct you on that. And so what do I mean when I say that they're bringing their own traditions into the church? If we go here to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you notice here it says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. So if you read the scholars, what you will find out is that this all things, you notice that it's in quotes, all things are lawful for me. That chances are Paul is quoting a catchphrase of the Corinthians. The Corinthians are saying, all things are lawful for me. And Paul grabs this catchphrase and then he corrects it. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. So he grabs their catchphrase and he adjusts it so that they can then begin to live better Christian lives. So let's go back here. And so I think that's very much what is happening in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, is that the Corinthians have this idea and this tradition that they're bringing into the church, and Paul is trying to correct that. And this tradition is that a woman has to pray with her head covered because the man is the head of the woman, as in the husband is in charge of the wife. And if that is the case, if you take that by saying that the head of a wife is her husband, as like the catchphrase of the Corinthians, then Paul is correcting it, and the head of Christ is God. If you are reading that the husband is to like control type of a situation, then this causes a separation in the Godhead, because there is now the head of Christ is God. Remember that the Godhead, there is no separation, there is no division in the Godhead. And so if you are reading this as some sort of division inside of a husband and wife, then you are reading this incorrectly, because you are not paying attention to what Paul has just called you to when he says the head of Christ is God. If you talk about this as subordination, then that is a classic heresy that was fought against in the early councils, that you cannot have the subordination of the Son, especially what is now called the eternal subordination of the Son. That is straight up heresy, and do not go that direction. And so Paul, I think, is now starting to play with the Corinthians saying what they are teaching, and he's trying to correct that. Let's try to find the place where Paul is arguing against a teaching that the Corinthians are bringing into the church. And I think if we come down here to verse 10, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. A wife has to be covered. She's got to be covered. And so she has to have an authority on her head. Therefore, she has to be in subjection to her husband, and the husband is to rule over her, type of a thing. But I think that is what the Corinthians are bringing into the church. And the reason why I say that is if we come down here to verse 13, where Paul says, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Is this the case? Right? This is what they believe. Is this the case? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? Okay, we're going to come back to her glory in a minute. But then we get in the orange here, for her hair is given to her as a covering, right? This is she has to cover her head. Why? Why does she need to cover her head? Verse 10, because the wife has to have a symbol of authority on her head. And then Paul says, but her hair is her covering. So the Corinthians are arguing that a woman has to cover her head because she has to have a sign of authority on her head. She has to have a covering on her head. And Paul says, her hair is her covering. And then let's take a look at glory. Her hair is her glory. Well, the reason why I came here when I was thinking about Corinthians in the first place is back here because of the long-haired. When the long-haired in Israel take the lead, that if long-haired is a symbol for leaders, then what is Paul doing here? For her hair is given to her as a covering, or her hair as for if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. When the long-haired take the lead. If a woman has long hair, it is for her glory. And what is glory? Well, let's take a look here. If we go to the book, Conform to the Image of His Son, reconsidering Paul's theology of glory in Romans, what does the word glory mean? There is a particular section in the book that I have pulled out, and I'm just going to read it for us. In nearly every instance of doxa, which is the word for glory, and doxazo, glorified. So in every instance of glory and glorified in association with humanity in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Bible, of the Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament. So in nearly every instance that you find the word glory and glorified in the Greek version of the Old Testament, it is in reference to the exalted status and honor the person possesses, or in which they exist, rather than a visible splendor after the likeness of God's theophanic splendor. And so then what does she say? This is 93. What's 93? So Harrison writes that when glory is used of persons, it reflected noteworthy elements such as dignity or character, dignity of character, comma, position, comma, wealth, comma, power. Thus, the king's glory consisted in the multitude of his people. But by contrast, the glory and pomp of the rebellious people would receive its reward by being banished to Sheol. So, what is happening here? What does the author of this book say? More precisely, humanity's glory and glorification as exalted status or possessed honors often associated with the person's status as king, ruler, or person of authority. So what does glory mean? Glory, you can talk about as a crown. What does a crown do on a person's head? It points to their status as ruler, or leader, or king, or their position of power. So glory is the word in the same way that a crown exists for the eyes, glory exists for the ears, to understand that there is an exalted status, a position. And so, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. It is the sign of her rulership, her power, her leadership. For her hair is given to her for a covering. So Paul is fighting against the Corinthians who are saying that she has to cover her hair because she has to be under a position of authority. But Paul says her long hair is her glory. When the long-haired in Israel take the lead. Long-haired is a visual image of a leader. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Nowhere else in the New Testament do we have a letter that's arguing for a woman to have a covering on her head. Why? Because Paul is saying that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist in the churches. It only exists in Corinth because they are bringing this idea in and forcing it onto the church. Paul says, no, I commend you for obeying the things that I have given to you, but I want you to pay attention here that this does not exist in the churches. So hold fast to the tradition that a woman's long hair is her glory. It is her covering. She does not need to have a covering on her head. It is her covering given to her by God. All things are lawful for me. This is what the Corinthians says, and Paul corrects it by saying, but not all things are helpful. A woman has to have a covering on her head, and Paul says her hair is her covering. It is her glory. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you.